bestseller.
How did they market it? With you being an unknown and the topics a little controversial?
They did something very clever. They sent it to every church in the country that they could get an address on. And mostly they were what you'd want to call, I guess, New Thought churches, but churches nonetheless are organized religions, and the churches, and they invited the ministers, read it and see what you think. If you think it's worthwhile to pass along to your congregation, please do so. So they gave free copies to all those ministers, and the ministers loved it. And the book wound up being on the church book tables in the back of the church hall, all over the country. And so congregants began picking it up. Well, once the book got into the hands of actual people, not just ministers, but regular folks, it took off because they would tell other people about it. You got to read this book. You can't believe this book. And
yes.
And so many people heard about it, and many people wound up buying it. And before we knew it, we had made. Gee, this sounds so self-aggrandizing. I don't like to talk about this the way I am. I'm realizing I'm sounding very boastful, but you're asking a question. But the book wound up on the New York Times bestseller list relatively quickly, but 9 weeks after it was out. And
so from being in the state of you might want to commit suicide, you're hopeless, to this.
Yeah, and the book stayed on the bestseller list for
Yes.
2.5 years.
I was one of the people who said, let me buy 20 copies and give it to all my friends.
Yeah, for 137
Yes.
weeks, and it
Yes.
wound up being translated into 37 languages.
Yes.
So suddenly, overnight, just as you're characterizing, I was like, whoa, let me see if I have this straight. My private middle-of-the-night journaling has turned into a global bestseller. And it was an interesting experience.
Yes.
Because I was,
I'm sure.
and everybody wanted to talk to me about it. Larry King and Oprah and the Today Show, and
Your life turned around.
yeah,
completely.
and I'm not bragging about that, because actually it was scary. People were thinking of me in a different way, and they thought that I had a direct line to God, and they needed to listen to my every word, and so it was a very interesting chapter of my life.
Yeah, from my experience when I read it, I didn't put any of that pressure on you. What I loved about it, that it was so raw, and you were able to articulate questions that so many people have, and regardless of your answer, it didn't matter. You were able to touch the core of each and every one of us who read your book, and even think of our own questions to ask, and your answers were wonderful, what God said or whatever you channeled. And even if it wasn't perfect, it gave you something to work with, of going, oh, I could work with this, and it could help open the doors to where people were stuck. And that's what I really liked about the book. It was a wonderful, like, workbook. Like you're saying, it's when people aren't that real with each other, people aren't that honest, people don't go that deep, and you did, and you showed that. You showed your soul to the world, and I think people connected with that.
I think it was a case of James Thurber's Everyman.
Yes.
And so people, as you said, in many cultures, not just the American culture, but all over the world. I mean, the book was read really everywhere.
Yes.
In 37 languages, as I mentioned. And it turned out that I had an experience, in terms of the questions I was asking and the frustrations I was having with life, that was very common. Very common human experience.
Yes.
So nobody could read that book and not see it themselves, at least in some of it.
Of course.
This is exactly what I've been. And so you're right, that's what happened. And that's what turned the book into a bestseller, because it spoke for, I want to say, the human race.